Dynamic equilibrium. This is a term that is taught in the introductions to sociology. However, in my view, it is not necessarily like something that is well established in contemporary sociology in any case, whereas it does have its place in the historical narrative or discourse of sociology, that at some point in time there was a notion that a society had functional spheres, and those functional spheres essentially had to be in some way equilibrated. And essentially that was part of the effort to create a grand theory, some sort of large-scale encompassing account of how society functions. At the same time, it seems to be outdated, and then I question the notion of either equilibrium, or that it can be either maintained or that it has to be dynamically essentially re-established, since whereas on one hand it does make sense in many contexts, such as if one thinks about the relations in between the economic sphere and the political sphere, or the economic sphere and the social sphere, so that there are interrelations and there are certain functions that each sphere obviously does or performs. At the same time, whether one can actually define an equilibrium in the relations in between these spheres remains very much an open question, and then how those dynamics of that equilibrium can be described or theorized or actually even documented in the first place are not really clear to me. So that whereas in historical terms, the notion of dynamic can be most closely or cogently associated with the systems theory or functional theory, such as that offered in the works of Talcott Parsons in the 1950s. I'm not sure this is something that can be actually something that is actually of relevance anymore, especially given the non-systematic nature of a lot of social theory, of a lot of research, which happens almost entirely in separation from a lot of theoretical developments historically, which took place in the discipline, and especially if one thinks about different schools or different countries separated by other linguistic boundaries or barriers, or maybe by other, let's say, large-scale differences, such as maybe French sociology as opposed to German sociology, and as opposed to American sociology or British sociology, for that matter, if one mentions only the major schools in social thought, without essentially forgetting developments elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in Asia, elsewhere in the world at the same time. And those initiatives could also be developing their own national schools of social thought, and a very special or specific way of actually approaching how society works, what equilibrium can be actually of relevance. In this respect, one can think of China and of the emphasis on the harmonious interrelations in China, so that that country has its own a set of values which sometimes are mentioned as Asian values, even though it is a debatable term in its own right, or say maybe elsewhere in Asia, where there is a sense of social interrelations, or the place that social interchange place in social affairs, and maybe also in economic affairs, and that could be something that is at the root of a certain economic policy or certain social policies that are being implemented in certain countries in Asia. And one can also think of Singapore as one of the more interesting examples of how some sort of an interventionist social policy, a certain economic policy, a certain I would say culture of doing politics on the national level are basically imbricated, interrelated with one another. At the same time, I'm not sure one can also speak of some sort of an equilibrium being established or re-established. So once again, I'm not quite sure how that can be thought of in specific, let's say, data-driven terms, such as in economics, where one thinks of, let's say, most of the equilibrium between supply and demand. That one would have to think about what is the supply and demand in different social spheres, and then how these also interrelate with those interplays in other social spheres. Let's say a supply of the political discourse and demand for it on the one hand, and then one can think about the supply and demand of money on the financial market, maybe supply and demand of economic or financial regulation, and then one would have to think about the supply and demand of the social maybe goods or social, let's say, socially desirable outcomes, and where from others actually procured. In other words, the most let's say more recent social thinker I can think of is Richard Jung, who comes from Germany, and he's very much in the tradition of systems theory, in the tradition of actually Tolbert Parsons. And he would be thinking in terms of equilibria, so that for him, such interrelations such as between different spheres could be equilibrated to maybe a greater or a smaller extent, and then one could think of maybe functions and dysfunctions of certain arrangements in between economy, society, politics, and culture. So that those relations can be thought of both structurally in static terms and more dynamically in terms of what is happening over time, or maybe what is happening in terms of the changes happening over time in certain countries or in certain domains over time, such as maybe, let's say, the financial deregulation which has been happening in Western countries so over the last 40 years, and then those events, those outcomes could be said to have the supply side, somebody actually promoting those I would say changes, and then the demand side, that maybe those who would be first on the receiving end on the one hand, and also those who would be probably the benefit agents, those who would be actively benefiting from these outcomes or those outcomes. And then, of course, one could think about the negative effects of those changes, and I think that those outcomes, be the positive or negative, create their own dynamics, and they need to equilibrate. Other, let's say, the positive effects, maybe the supply of reforms or the supply of money or the supply of whatnot, and then whether that actually leads to issues with maybe oversupply or undersupply, and how that is actually, I would guess, either mitigated or addressed on the level of each system.